The SCP Foundation has encountered its fair share of incredibly tough adversaries and fearsome monsters, but none are as formidable or at least as durable as SCP-682, the hard-to-destroy reptile. We've talked about this behemoth before in a number of mind-boggling videos, and all of the increasingly desperate lengths the Foundation has gone to in order to terminate it. We've gotten so desperate to put this thing to rest that we've even reached out to all of you for suggestions on the matter. Sadly, they've thrown 682 together with some of the most destructive anomalies in Foundation custody, and it's slithered out of seemingly inescapable danger every time. So much so that we've noticed certain researchers on the 682 case have started drinking a little more heavily as of late. Sometimes the threats didn't leave so much as a dent in the monster's scales. Sometimes the other creatures ran screaming at the sight of it, and sometimes 682 mutated and twisted its form in ways that were shocking even to a Foundation research team that's seen just about all there is to see. After all, 682's truly insane adaptability has always been its #1 power, and the key to its infuriating death-defying abilities. And these are some of SCP-682's craziest mutations. During one round of tests, SCP-682 was released into an enclosure with SCP-272, a nail that traps any living thing in place when it is dropped onto the organism's shadow. 682 was surrounded by 32,000-watt stadium lights, one of which was switched on. As soon as it entered the enclosure, a D-Class dropped the nail onto the creature's shadow. It was promptly pinned in place, and all 30 lights were switched on and off in random patterns, causing the reptile to be hurled around the room at devastating speeds. After nearly an hour of this, about 95% of the monster's skin had been worn down. 63 of its teeth had been broken from its jaw, and its eyeballs had come loose from their sockets. At this point, something truly bizarre happened. The exposed tissue beneath 682's top layer of skin, previously bloody and dark red, began to give off a bright white light. The subdermal tissue grew steadily brighter and brighter until it eclipsed the glow from the stadium lights and removed any shadows cast along the floor. It collapsed on the ground and continued giving off violently bright light for the next 48 hours, so bright that it caused permanent retinal damage to all personnel in the room. Hell of a light show, but this next mutation proves just how hard it is to lick SCP-682, especially when it develops the tools to start licking back. SCP-743 is a chocolate fountain that exhibits some carnivorous qualities. When it is near a living organism, especially if it consumes the fountain's delicious chocolate, it produces swarms of ant-like monsters that devour the organism piece by piece, carrying the bits into the fountain until nothing is left. The research team was curious about the possibilities of introducing 743 to 682, so it was transported to the reptile's testing chamber. Within a few minutes, chocolate began to flow from the fountain. 682 was curious and began to drink from it. It may hate almost everything, but even 682 can't resist chocolate. It drank greedily for several minutes until the Foundation began releasing the ants. Within moments, 682 was covered in ants, and in spite of its best efforts to fight off the swarm, it was completely covered and rendered immobile. The ants made quick work of the massive creature, and after several minutes it was stripped down to less than 80% of its original mass. It seemed as if this might truly be it for the beast, but then it opened its mouth. It unfurled its tongue, now over 5 meters long and sticky, comparable to an enlarged version of an anteater's tongue. It began lapping up the ants, thousands at a time picked up by its mutated tongue. As it devoured the ants, more poured out of the fountain, slicing off pieces of 682's flesh with their pinchers and carrying them back to the fountain. They reached a symbiotic pace, feeding on each other in equal measure for hours until testing was terminated. That was a sticky situation, but trust me, this next crazy mutation will really blow you away. SCP-3108, also known as the Nerfing Gun, is an altered toy gun that turns anything it hits into an inferior version of itself. When the gun was fired at a tissue sample taken from SCP-682, The sample turned into a piece of tissue from a giant leaf-tailed gecko. Hoping to carry this over and turn 682 into a harmless animal, a D-class officer was sent into the containment chamber to fire the gun at the entity. Once it was hit with the foam dart, it began to transform. Unfortunately, instead of becoming a simple gecko, it began to mutate. It grew larger, its muscles bulging noticeably beneath its scaly skin. Its teeth grew longer, sharper, its tongue sprouting teeth of its own. It opened its mouth to roar, and it appeared that the teeth, long curved fangs with a deadly tip, went all the way back down the beast's throat. Security officers were deployed to temporarily neutralize the monster, but found that it was even more powerful than before. Not only was it bigger, but it had developed a new ability. When threatened, it would begin to vibrate at a high rate, grinding its teeth together, and would explode in a burst of fire and meaty chunks. Fangs flew in every direction like shrapnel, tearing into personnel and lodging in their skin. This is an impressive move, but it seems like a one-time trick, right? Wrong. The bits and pieces, no matter how tiny or how flattened to mush, would crawl back together and form the creature all over again. It was able to escape containment like this, killing an untold number of personnel before it was temporarily incapacitated and returned to its containment. Mutating back into life from a self-induced explosion is pretty crazy, but surely you can't mutate back from nothing at all, right? Right? Oh boy, I don't like that look you're giving me. SCP-3930 is a void located near Usinsk, Russia, within which nothing exists. Once something has passed within its border, it ceases to be, though outside observers will be able to perceive them for a small time after. SCP-682 was brought into 3930 and it walked inside. Once there, it ceased existing. However, even though 682 no longer existed, Foundation personnel looking at the void could still see the beast. Whenever they viewed it, a strong image appeared in the brain of the person looking, and it had the exact appearance of SCP-682. Somehow, even when it didn't exist, 682 was able to attack and kill various personnel. These people did not die from physical damage, but from their brain function suddenly, inexplicably, stopping. The reptile defied the rules of the void, somehow causing real destruction even though it was not real. 15 hours later, 682 was found in its containment chamber as if nothing had happened at all. It had been snuffed out of existence and had mutated its way back into reality with no explanation. Well, that was existentially terrifying. Thank 343, at least there's only one of those things. Oh no. SCP-3207 is a highly efficient mobile war machine, outfitted with cannons capable of firing blasts that can vaporize organic matter on contact. This seems like a good match for something supposedly indestructible. 3207 was fired at SCP-682 several times, appearing to destroy it completely except for a smudge on the floor of the chamber. The reptile was gone for a duration of 6 hours before something strange began to happen. Globs of tissue began to clump together, forming 5 separate piles. They pulled closer and closer together, compressing into 5 reptilian creatures. They writhed around, getting used to their new legs and teeth, snapping their jaws at any living thing in sight. Overwhelming and surprising the security personnel, who had been lulled into a false sense of security by the apparent defeat of 682. The 5 smaller versions of the entity were able to escape containment. Once they had made it into the hallway, they began to clamber over each other, their scales shifting, eyeballs squeezing together and fusing into one eye, skin stretching like hot rubber over unnaturally bendy bone. As the shocked security personnel watched, the 5 lizards melted into one, becoming a full-sized version of SCP-682 that was good as new. They were able to contain it after a great deal of effort, but one of the researchers requested a note to be added to the research notes for the day, and applied going forward: do not explode. Okay, so the big lizard is a constant threat. Got it. Still, wouldn't it be nice if 682 could make itself a little smaller? I can't imagine anything bad coming from that. SCP-1056 is an anomalous kitchen timer capable of changing the size of living objects. The Foundation wanted to see how long it would take 682 to return to its original size after being shrunk, so they built a testing chamber connected to 1056's dial, and released 682 inside, sealing the door behind it. The dial was set to 0.25. and the activation button was pressed. 682 thrashed around, bellowing as parts of its body expanded and contracted at random. Then, with no warning, it disappeared. D-Class personnel were deployed to investigate the chamber, but it seemed to be completely gone. There was no sign of it. It's pretty hard to lose a giant lizard, so naturally, they were all a bit perplexed. The chamber was kept sealed, under the assumption that 682 had to still be inside somewhere. Sometime later, a security officer spotted 682 outside of Site-19, returned to its original size. Somehow, during the test, 682 used the effects of 1056 to strengthen its ability to change its own size. It adapted and shrank to a size so small that no one watching could even see it anymore, and it slipped out through the sealed door. It was even temporarily able to change the size of other objects around it, shrinking weapons used to contain down until they were useless. Okay, so 682 is pretty cool under pressure, but what if we made it a whole lot colder? Most of the testing on 682 is done with other anomalies. However, sometimes the Foundation likes to simplify it a bit. Dr. Carlson suggested they try something a bit more basic: liquid nitrogen. 1 ton of liquid nitrogen was poured onto SCP-682 from above. As it tends to do, the liquid nitrogen promptly froze the beast solid. It remained stuck in place for about 10 minutes until it began to melt the frozen cast around it. Its core body temperature seemed to skyrocket, producing intense heat that fully thawed it in 3 minutes. It didn't stop there, though. The temperature continued to increase, growing hotter and hotter as if to deliberately punish the research staff for even attempting to freeze it. It became so hot that the research staff had to leave the room. An attending doctor's pen melted, the plastic burning his hands. Steam rose off the sides of its body, fogging up the windows of the room. The test was abandoned after the sides of the containment chamber began to melt, and they worried the creature would be able to breach containment. Once it was left alone, 682 cooled back down to its usual temperature. Maybe we should see what happens if we try a slightly greener method of destruction. 682 was exposed to SCP-166, a young nature spirit that can cause organic matter in her vicinity to decompose. As soon as 166 was released into its chamber, 682 began to run toward her, even as its body began to melt. As it got closer, it began to decay and fall apart more rapidly, pieces of its body softening and sloughing off in chunks. By the time it reached 166, it had melted down into the shape of a patch of grass covered with colorful wildflowers. 15 minutes later, it began to regenerate itself as it usually does, its body reconstituting at the same rate it was melting. The regeneration process began to speed up, going faster and faster until it surpassed the rate of melting. A piece of the monster would soften and flop to the ground, but by the time it landed, a patch of regrowth had already replaced it. It eventually beat the melting process and regenerated to its original form, with one difference. It had a sprinkling of flowers and mushrooms on its back, resembling a forest clearing. It was almost pretty, even on top of such a foul creature, until a full-size tree suddenly burst out of its back, shooting up to a height of 10 feet and puncturing the roof of its containment chamber. And I'm afraid that's all we have time for one video. But this only just scratches the surface of the weird and wild mutations we've come to expect from SCP-682. Want another video on even more crazy mutations from the hard-to-destroy reptile? Make your feelings known down in the comments. Now go check out How to Kill SCP-682 Theories and Ideas, and SCP-682 Ways SCP Foundation Tried to Kill Hard-to-Destroy Reptile for more about the Foundation's face-offs with this seemingly indestructible beast.